Welcome to qnawire.
So in this problem, you're given this formula that represents momentum, and basically you're being asked to solve for each of the 6 different variables in the problem. So if we start by trying to get m1 by itself. So I'm going to take our original equation, m1v1 plus m2v2, and as you noted, it's equal to m1 v1 prime plus m2 v2 prime. So first thing, if I'm solving for m sub 1, I notice that it's located in 2 different terms. So the first thing I need to do is get the 2 terms with the m1 by itself, and then the terms that don't have m1 on the other side of the equation. So I'm going to do this by first subtracting m1 v1 prime from both sides of our equation, because then the m1 v1 primes cancel on the right. And on the left-hand side, I'm also going to subtract m2 v2 from both sides, because then these terms will cancel as well. So now none of these are like terms. So we're just left with m1 v1 minus m1 v1 prime, and this is equal to m2 v2 prime. Right here. So again, this is going to give us m2 v2 prime minus m2 v2. So now notice on the left-hand side, both of those terms contain m1. So kind of like the opposite of distributing, I'm going to factor out an m1, which means I'll just be left with v1 minus v1 prime. Again, you could check by distributing, you get back to your second line. So now I'm just bringing down the right-hand side. So now we can isolate m1 by dividing both sides of our equation by v1 minus v1 prime. And again, we're dividing because it's getting multiplied by that term. So these terms cancel on the left. And so now we've isolated m sub 1. So m sub 1 is equal to m sub 2 v sub 2 prime minus m sub 2 v sub 2, all divided by v sub 1 minus v sub 1 prime. And now you've isolated your m sub 1 term. Okay, well that's the first one. The next thing we can do is we can isolate v sub 1. So if I start with v sub 1, again, let's write down our equation. We have m1 v1 plus m2 v2 equals m1 v1 prime plus m2 v2 prime. So the first thing, I notice that v sub 1 only occurs in this first term. So all I'm going to do is move the other term, m2 v2, to the right-hand side by subtracting it, because again, both of these terms will cancel out. So now we're going to have m1 v1 is equal to m1 v1 prime plus m2 v2 prime, and then minus m2 v2. We don't combine these because none of them are like terms. So now, because v sub 1 is getting multiplied by m sub 1, I just need to divide both sides of my equation by m sub 1. The m sub 1s will cancel. So now, because m sub 1 does not go into every term in the numerator, we can simply just write this as m1 v1 prime plus m2 v2 prime minus m2 v2, and it's all getting divided by m sub 1. So now we've isolated v sub 1. So this would be your equation. All right, well, if we're going in order, the next term would be m sub 2. So we'll put that off to the side. And again, I'm going to write down our formula, m1 v1 plus m2 v2 equals m1 v1 prime plus m2 v2 prime. Now, this one is just like the very first one we did, because m2 occurs in 2 different points here, all right? It's in 2 different terms. So first thing, we're going to get the m2s on one side and the terms that don't have m2s on the other side. So in other words, I'm going to start by subtracting m2 v2 prime from both sides of our equation, because they'll cancel on the right. And at the same time, I'm going to subtract m1 v1 from both sides. That way we'll have the m2s by themselves, because these terms will cancel. So now we're left with m2 v2 minus m2 v2 prime is equal to m1 v1 prime minus m1 v1. Now, just like before, on the left-hand side, because both terms contain m2, I can factor that out, which leaves us with just v2 minus v2 prime. Again, you can check by distributing. And then I'm just bringing down the right-hand side. So now, because m2 is getting multiplied by v2 minus v2 prime, to get m2 by itself, we're just going to divide both sides of our equation by v2 minus v2 prime. The terms on the left hand cancel, so now we finally isolated m sub 2. And on the right-hand side, we can't simplify. So we'll have m1 v1 prime minus m1 v1, all divided by v2 minus v2 prime. And now we've solved for m sub 2. So if we're going in order, the next thing I want to isolate is v sub 2. So again, I'm going to bring down the formula, just so we don't have to keep scrolling up to the top. And for the right-hand side, we have m1 v1 prime plus m2 v2 prime. So notice v sub 2 is only in one term. So the first thing I'm going to move is from the left-hand side, I'm going to take away m sub 1 v sub 1 from both sides, because that term will cancel out. So now we're just left with m2 v sub 2 is equal to m1 v1 prime plus m2 v2 prime. Oh, and I realized I put a square here. That should have been a prime symbol. So we have m2 v2 prime, and then minus m1 v1. None of those like terms, so we don't combine them. Well, now v sub 2 is getting multiplied by m sub 2. So all we're going to do is divide both sides of our equation by m sub 2. So now we have that v sub 2 is equal to m1 v sub 1 prime plus m2 v sub 2 prime minus m1 v1, all divided by m sub 2. And we can't simplify any further, so we can leave this as our equation for v sub 2. All right, well, going down in the order of our problem, we already did m sub 1, so that's all set. Next, we have v sub 1 prime. So again, let me just write down our formula real quick for us. m1 v1 prime plus m2 v2 prime. So, as you can see, v1 prime only occurs in one term. So, just like the previous problem, I'm going to start by subtracting m2 v2 prime from both sides. And as you can see, it's not a like term, so we're going to bring down m1 v1 plus m2 v2 minus m2 v2 prime, and this is equal to m1 v1 prime. So now, because v1 prime is getting multiplied by m sub 1, we simply just divide both sides of our equation by m sub 1. So that leaves us with m1 v1 plus m2 v2 minus m2 v2 prime, and this is all getting divided by m sub 1. So now we've solved this equation for v sub 1 prime. All right, lastly, we've already done v sub 2, but we need to solve for v sub 2 prime. So again, let me just jot down this equation real quick. So we have m1 v1 plus m2 v2 equals m1 v1 prime plus m2 v2 prime. So now, just like before, we only have one v sub 2 prime. So first thing we're going to do is subtract the m1 v1 prime from both sides. It doesn't have a like term, so that's going to leave us with m1 v1 plus m2 v2 minus m1 v1 prime, and this is equal to m sub 2 times v sub 2 prime. And v sub 2 prime is getting multiplied by m sub 2. So we just divide both sides of our equation by m sub 2. And so now we're going to have m1 v1 plus m2 v2 minus m1 v1 prime, all divided by m sub 2. And that can't be simplified, and this is equal to v sub 2 prime. So now you've found your equations for each of the 6 different variables.